One of the best people you know to help with the release from suffering is you. Not just because you have the ability to help others, as we often discuss, but because you could be your first line of defense, your first resource to help yourself when you are suffering. So today we consider how to help yourself, specifically when you're dealing with grief, because after all, this is the Death Dhamma podcast. Hi, it's Margaret Meloni, and welcome to the Death Dhamma podcast. I'm a Buddhist practitioner out here in the world, having experienced the loss of my loved ones and knowing how much my Buddhist practice helped me on my grief journey. And now, together, we have this safe space to discuss death, dying, grief, and the Buddhist teachings that help us really understand attachment, impermanence, being compassionate, being death ready, what it means to live a life so that we can have a peaceful death. Yep, it's a big topic, and we're going to take it on together. Let's go. Perhaps one of the best ways to help yourself become comfortable with death and grief is to recognize that you are not comfortable with death and grief. And do you know what that means? It means you are normal, but this recognition can be the beginning of you helping yourself on the journey to gain some relief from suffering when it comes to fear of death, fear of losing loved ones, and grieving lost people and lost relationships. In times of your own suffering, remember to be your own best friend and to practice radical self-compassion. Don't think that you're doing something wrong. Don't beat yourself up over what you're not doing. Remember that you're doing the best you can. From season 1 of the Death Dhamma podcast, I look back and I see where Noel Illuminate, who was our first guest on the podcast, by the way, he talks about a time during the AIDS pandemic when he and his volunteers were chastised for spending time assembling safer sex kits. They spent hours putting those kits together, but their director told them they should be spending their time differently and that others should be putting together the kits. But the staff therapist stepped in and advised the director that what they were doing was good for their mental health. They were together and having this communal experience of doing something proactive. The repetitive nature of the task helped them process the grief and trauma that they were experiencing. And it was during this time that a wise woman reminded Noel that it was time to slow down and to not worry about productivity. Very insightfully, she said, "We are human beings, not human doings." And I remember when Noel said that statement when we were talking, how impactful it was to me as a person who's always trying to run around being productive. And during difficult times, I may seek to relieve my suffering by keeping busy. And maybe that's the right thing for me because I'm going to practice radical self-compassion right now and not beat myself up. But it doesn't hurt me to remember that also I'm a being, not a doing. It was, when he said that, it was just, I thought, what an amazing reminder for all of us. When you're going through grief, it's okay to be and not to worry about how much you do. You will do once you give yourself time to be, right? This is definitely in agreement with Mary Stankiewicz, another guest on the podcast. In fact, she's been on the podcast multiple times. She taught me, just because something comes up for you in meditation doesn't mean it's a call to action. It might be a call to being. So as you feel grief or fear of death, think about how you are expressing yourself, whether through your internal dialogue or in communication with others. You could be unintentionally creating a lasting narrative, and that lasting narrative might tie you to your own suffering, which is why we talk about it now. An example of a narrative, there was a man who carried guilt and trauma over a divorce. And he kept saying, 20 years ago, I went through this horrible, painful, traumatic divorce. It just tore our family apart. He expressed this to Timber Hawkeye, another guest on the podcast. And Timber asked the man if he could say that again, but this time dropping all the adjectives. And the man thought about it and said, 20 years ago, I went through a divorce. When he dropped the adjectives, he dropped the weight of the judgment he was carrying around. And that helped him with his own relief from suffering. He was carrying around this narrative that was causing him suffering. We also want to look at gratitude and acceptance. When Mary Stankiewicz needs an immediate way to accept painful or to intercept painful emotions, she uses this mantra. Right now, it is like this. This helps her pause and consider what is happening right now in her body and in her mind, and accept that whatever she's feeling is fine. It's okay. It keeps her from being overrun by her thoughts and fears. So now you think about this. As you come to a place where you can accept how things are, can you allow your gratitude practice to kick in? What mantra can you create for yourself during times of suffering to help you on the path of your relief from suffering? I can remember trying to figure out the benefits of having the two people who were closest to me die within 1 week of each other. And it came to me as people asked how I was doing, and I would reply, I am as well positioned as possible for such a difficult situation, which was true. I had a roof over my head, I had food on the table, and I had other people who cared about me. I had some degree of security, and I didn't have to make big life-changing decisions. I lived near the beach with a path perfect for contemplative walks. I had 2 crazy cats who knew how to stay close to me. I had a friend who brought me giant croissants. I had another friend who went with me to my mother's out-of-state funeral. And I had an uncle who called me every Sunday morning, before the Patriots games though, to check on me. The more I looked for things to be grateful for, the more I found. So each day I challenged myself to come up with 3 things for which I was grateful. Some days were really difficult, right? But it was possible to find 3 things every day, even if on some days I needed to repeat a list from a previous day, which is fine because there was no rule. And coming up with 3 was an exercise in just finding other things and, in a way, not turning off my sorrow, not turning off my grief, but bringing myself to accept some gratitude, which was helping me to renew and to restore, and did give me some relief from grief, and so therefore some relief from suffering, right? Now the cats, the cats don't have high marks for being caring or empathetic. My 2 rallied around me. One of them was always right next to me. Sometimes I wondered if perhaps they had set up some kind of schedule, right? Like one had mornings, the other had afternoons, and they both took evenings. One or both of them would always curl up next to me when I was trying to sleep. And it could have been just because there was extra room in the bed or it was cold. But I knew I was not alone. And so I allowed, I'll say myself, to recognize and enjoy the healing power of a pet. And that was something else that helped me to have relief from suffering. Now, I have to say I didn't feel suicidal, but certainly I experienced depression. And those 2 furry creatures, having them depending on me for their care, was a great way to take me out of myself. For a few moments every day, my thoughts were directed toward their care. So it seemed like taking care of the cats gave me some kind of purpose, something to do beyond feeling sad or attending to the business of death. On days when I didn't want to be around humans, I had companionship. When I talked to myself, did that, still do, at least there was something there listening, or I could pretend that there was something there listening, so I didn't have to stack on the suffering of, am I losing my mind because I'm talking to myself, right? So, there's the healing power of the pets. So if you have pets and you're going through a time of suffering, allow them to be part of your way of helping yourself. Also, go back to the basics. For me, that meant going back to the basics of my Buddhist practice. When we were discussing helpful teachings, one of the first things that Venerable Dehong said, and you've heard him on the podcast here, I think at least 3 times, go back to the Four Noble Truths. Pay attention to the Four Noble Truths, and you will read, now this, monks, is the noble truth of stress. Birth is stressful, aging is stressful, death is stressful, sorrow, lamentation, pain, distress, and despair are stressful. Association with the unbeloved is stressful. Separation from the loved is stressful. Not getting what is wanted is stressful. In short, the 5 clinging aggregates are stressful. That's from the Samyutta Nikaya passage 56.11. So death is a physical process that brings psychological and emotional suffering. The dead is at peace, are at peace, right? Or so we think, or so we want. We want them to have had that peaceful death. But it's the survivors, it's you and I, who will experience the dukkha, the suffering. So in addition to the first noble truth, Venerable D reminded me about the 5 recollections. And the 5 recollections are posted on this podcast. I think it's in season 1. And it is, I am of the nature to die. I am of the nature to be sick. It's a recognition. So the 5 recollections, these are ways for us to remember that we will die, we will get sick, we will lose things, our physical and mental state will change. And that isn't meant to bring us more suffering. It is actually meant to get us to come to terms or to peace with what will happen to us. So are we prepared? We are prepared. And then we have less suffering. And every year on his birthday, Venerable D reminds us that he's 1 year closer to the casket. He's not being dismissive of the many birthday greetings he receives. He's reminding us that aging is part of our experience. If you're fortunate to age, you're recognizing the signs of death. So we don't want to be pessimistic, but we do want to be realistic. And in this realism, we will find strength, and it will reduce our suffering when we have to think about the death of others or ourselves. Venerable Guanzen, who is with us on season 1, goes to the teachings on dependent origination. And he says those helped him through his grief. At a high level, those are teachings that help us grasp that, when one condition exists, other conditions will arise. For example, the first that you are born means that you will die. Or when desire arises, suffering will arise. When there's clinging and attachment, there will also be suffering. A brief overview of this teaching is like this. When this exists, that comes to be. With the arising of this, that arises. When this does not exist, that does not come to be. With the cessation of this, that ceases. That is also the Samyutta Nikaya, that's 12.61. You can get a lot more elaborate with this, and I'm not providing the full teaching, and I don't think I'm the right one really to go over the full teachings of dependent origination. But what I would like to point out here is that there are teachings available to us, remembering the 4 Noble Truths, looking into dependent origination, and other passages. So as you support yourself and you work on your own release from suffering, seek out and revisit the passages that help you again and again. Contemplating death, Maranasati, our mindfulness of death practice. We have an episode on that. I think it's in season 2, but you can find it. I believe it's called Maranasati for all of us. And in the first teaching, one of the teachings in the Anguttara Nikaya, AN 6.19, the focus is on the right way to develop mindfulness of death. You really need to understand the difference between thinking that you will live long enough to finish your meal versus understanding you could die while chewing one bite. And in a second teaching, Anguttara Nikaya 6.20, the Buddha encourages his monks to contemplate the many ways in which death can come. During the day, as day turns to night, as night turns to day, be contemplating these things. And by following these teachings, you'll cultivate mindfulness of death. And then it will become more comfortable to you, kind of second nature. Mary Stankiewicz, drawing from Tibetan Buddhism, specifically the teachings of Atisha, brought his contemplations on death to our discussion. And these too are helpful for us. Death is inevitable. Our lifespan is decreasing continuously. Death will come whether or not we are prepared for it. Human life expectancy is uncertain. There are many causes of death. The human body is fragile and vulnerable. At the time of death, our material resources are not of use to us. Our loved ones cannot keep us from death. Our own body cannot help us at the time of our death. So I can't place enough emphasis on how our ability to accept death helps us to be prepared, which helps us to have less suffering around death, dying, our own loss, the loss of others. And each Buddhist school approaches this topic of death and impermanence in their own way. There's overlap. And again, find the school of Buddhism and find the teachings that support you. Consistency is really key. And when we spoke to 12 wise teachers during season 1, which again, resulted in the book, Sitting with Death, they identified as being, whether they identified as being secular or spiritual, they had the collective experience of wisdom and practice and consistency, consistently going back to their practice, which you and I can do no matter where we are in our practice, no matter how many years we have or what practice we draw upon. So remember, you live in a time where the Buddhist teachings are accessible. Each school offers different teachings and different ways for you to invite death into your practice. And you have teachers to work with, and you have a community to sit with. So practice consistently. Venerable Sumedha said to us, don't regret about the past. Just don't daydream about the future. Don't panic about your future too much. Just live in the present moment. Be happy and do good and be good as much as you can. And that is the best way for you to be happy all the time. And by saying be happy all the time, he's not advocating hedonism. He's reminding us to be consistent in our practice, because when we do, even during your last breath, you will be aware, you might know this is your last minute, and that peace will come from that. And consistent and faithful practice will help us remain calm and will help us help ourselves in our own relief from suffering. I've got books for you, starting with Carpooling with Death, How Living with Death Will Make You Stronger, Wiser, and Fearless, the book that got me going and helped me to discuss going through the death of my loved ones, followed by Sitting with Death, Buddhist insights to help you face your fears and live a peaceful life, based on season 1 of the Death Dhamma podcast. And just recently, Enlightenment Unleashed, how your pet can lead you to spiritual transformation, because during our lifetime, we may see the rising and ceasing of many pets, and we love them like they are our family. Find these on Amazon.com or come see me at margaretmeloni.com. You've been listening to the Death Dhamma podcast with your host, Margaret Meloni. Thank you so much for being here. Come find me on margaretmeloni.com, margaretmeloni.com. And until we meet again, may you be well, may you be happy, may you be at ease, and may you be free from suffering. Bye for now.